of us refer to the church as the family of God. But what exactly do we mean by that? You see, in the West, we use the language of God's family to emphasize unity and equality. All of us are brothers and sisters together in God's family. So, one young man I know thinks that it's appropriate for him to rebuke an older woman in church for her wrong thinking. Because, he says, in God's family, we all stand equal. She may be an auntie in culture, but she really just is a sister in Christ. Now, while the concepts of equality and unity are legitimately part of that family concept, particularly in letters like Ephesians and Galatians, we get a very different picture when we read the pastoral epistles of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. You see, in these books, the household of God doesn't communicate unity and equality so much as authority and hierarchy, concepts that are much more familiar to Eastern understandings of the family unit. So in one sense, the auntie in culture is both a sister in Christ, but also an auntie in Christ. Her seniority as an older woman is preserved in the family of God. When we read that phrase, a household of God, in the pastoral epistles, we're not to imagine an intimate 21st century Western nuclear family. No, we're to imagine a highly structured first century Greco-Roman household, something that's far more similar to an Asian family unit. At the risk of generalizing, in the Western family, everyone has a place. But in the Eastern family, everyone has their place. In this session, I want to survey the pastoral epistles, and I want to demonstrate the following 2 points. Firstly, by describing the church as a household, Paul is actually preserving the traditional relationships of hierarchy to legitimize some aspects of a Greco-Roman or Eastern family unit. But secondly, by describing the church as the household of God, Paul transforms those relationships of hierarchy and actually challenges other aspects of those same family structures. And the key to understanding that transformation lies in God's position as the master of the house. And that is where we begin. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, Paul describes the church as the household of God. Now, in saying that, he doesn't simply mean a divine household or the household to which God belongs. No, just like the household of Stephanus or the household of Onesiphorus, he means the household under the leadership of God, the household ordered and arranged by God. You see, God orders relationships and designates the use of honorable and dishonorable vessels by virtue of his authority as the master of the house. Just like many Asian households, the traditional Greco-Roman household was highly patriarchal. Every person in the house found their place in relation to the master. The key positions being the wife of the master, the children of the master, and the slaves of the master. In many ways, he was like the sun around whom all other individuals would orbit like planets in this domestic solar system. And his central position in the household gave him unlimited authority over wife, children, and slaves, and authority and power extending even over life and death. Well, that is the position that Paul attributes to God. As the master of the house, God is the center and the source of all authority. Whatever conclusions we may reach about other relationships within the church, no, this must be our starting point. All relationships of authority must be connected to the source of authority, God, as the master of the house. So we now turn to consider those other relationships. Now, as we indicated earlier, Paul describes the church as a household. And in doing so, he preserves many of the traditional relationships of hierarchy in a Greco-Roman or Eastern family structure. So, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8 to 15, Paul preserves the hierarchical relationship between men and women, as he calls women to learn quietly with full submission. Then in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and Titus chapter 2, verses 1 to 8, he preserves the seniority of the old over the young, such that Timothy, as a younger man, must not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father. And in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and Titus chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, he preserves the submission of slaves to their masters as worthy of all respect. Now, interestingly, even when the master is a brother in Christ, he still retains his station as a master. So the slave should love him as a brother, but still respect him as a master. It's particularly notable that in chapter 5, verse 3 to 16 of 1 Timothy, Paul even preserves the integrity of the natural household. The church as God's household doesn't replace our natural families, but preserves them, and as we'll see, even transcends them. Now, some commentators argue that Paul's preservation of these hierarchical relationships is simply accommodating the surrounding Ephesian culture. It's a means of assimilating the church as a good Christian citizen in a hostile world. However, the reasons for this preservation cannot be reduced to mere cultural accommodation. After all, if that were the case, relationships within the church would be solely determined by changing cultural norms. Now, Paul actually preserves some of these hierarchical relationships in a manner that actually transcends the first century Ephesian context. So in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, he grounds the hierarchical relationship between men and women in a pre-fall created order. And in chapter 5, verses 17 to 18, the imperative to honor the elders is not based on Ephesian cultural norms of patriarchy, but the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. Indeed, in 1 Timothy, Paul is presenting the church as a microcosm of God's created order. In chapter 1, verse 4, he criticizes the false doctrine of the false teachers for not promoting God's plan. Now, that word plan, oikonomia, is a play on the word household, oikos. We might say that God's family is a picture of God's future. You see, the hierarchical relationships which God preserves are far more than mere cultural accommodation. They have continuing relevance for the church today. The continuity of these hierarchical relationships means that our spiritual status as brothers and sisters does not eliminate our social station as men and women, old and young. For the young man we met earlier, the auntie in church is actually still an auntie in Christ. And 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 indicates that she should be treated with the respect of a mother, even when she is in the wrong. Now, Paul doesn't simply adopt and just baptize these cultural relationships of hierarchy. Instead, he transforms them in connection to God. And this is where God's role as the master of the house becomes particularly relevant. As the center and source of all authority, he subordinates traditional positions of authority under him. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, it indicates that overseers of the church would have been masters of their own households. They would have exercised total authority over their own families. And yet, as overseers, they are curiously never referred to as masters of God's household. The unlimited authority they would exercise over their slaves in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, they do not have in the church. For the church is God's household, not theirs. In Titus chapter 1, verse 7, an overseer is referred to as a steward of God. That's a managerial position subordinate to the master. Just think of the parable of the dishonest manager in Luke 16, who is accountable to his master. That is the position of overseers in the church. You see, Paul is intentionally limiting the authority of the overseer under God. In his own household, the overseer might be the master with unquestionable authority. But in God's household, he is but a mere steward. And in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 20, he is actually liable to public rebuke for his sin, even at the hands of a younger man like Timothy. Now, in an honor-shame culture, it would be shameful for the master of the house to be rebuked, let alone publicly rebuked by a younger man. And yet, because this household is under the authority of God as its master, stewards are accountable for their actions, irrespective of their authority, their station, or their status in their own households. Here we see that God not only subordinates traditional positions of authority, no, he exalts positions of humility by delegating his authority to them, most notably to the young men. Now, unlike the typical overseers in the Ephesian church, Timothy is a young man. He is in a traditional position of humility. Indeed, his youth appears to be the very cause of people not recognizing or submitting to his leadership. However, in 1 Timothy 1:18 and 4:14, Paul reminds Timothy of the authority he exercises as one commissioned by God and commissioned through the council of elders. That is an authority delegated from the master of the house. Now, it would have been culturally inappropriate for a young man to have such authority, let alone exercise it over an older man. And yet, because Timothy is commissioned by the master, he is to set an example for all the believers, and that even includes those older than him. And while he should respect an older man by not rebuking him, that is, harshly excoriating him, in 1 Timothy 5:2, he is still called to exhort him. That is, Timothy is still called to exercise authority over an older man, notwithstanding the fact that he is younger in age. Now, in this sense, unlike the Greco-Roman or Eastern family structures, leadership in God's household is determined not by age or seniority, but by connection to the master. So notwithstanding her cultural seniority, the auntie that we met earlier in this session should still be open to receiving the counsel of the younger man, especially if this younger man is a leader in the church. In closing, I'd like to offer 4 implications for this preservation-transformation dynamic for Asian churches in Australia today. Firstly, no single family should exercise total authority in the church. We must beware the dynastic rule of founding families, key families, or the pastor's family. No one family rule over a local church collapses the household of God into the household of man, and it effectively displaces God as the master of the house. Secondly, church leadership should consist of godly men from both first and second generations. Now, while most overseers would have been older men, Timothy's example as a young man commissioned by the master warns us against excluding godly younger men from leadership purely because of their age. Thirdly, the second generation should always respect and honor the first generation. Paul preserves relationships of hierarchy within the church. And 1 Timothy 5:1-2 indicates that even when an older man or woman is in the wrong, they still deserve the respect their seniority demands. Finally, both generations should submit to the godly leadership of overseers and elders, both old and young. Please note, the young are not called to submit to all older people in the church, and older people are not called to submit only to elders who are older than them. No, they must also learn to submit to elders younger than them. If age is not a criteria for eldership, then it must not be a criteria for submission. Asian churches are well positioned to read the pastorals in their cultural context. They share many of the strengths which God seeks to preserve, and also many of the weaknesses which God seeks to transform. May all of us, whatever our church background, submit to God as the master of his house.